Jessica was sitting cross-legged on the couch by the living room window. The window looked out onto a small garden in front of the house, where the trees rustled softly in a light wind. Michael had already left for work a few hours ago. As always, she stayed at home with the children, cooked, cleaned, pretended that everything was fine with her. But it was a lie. Lying to yourself and to others. She had been married to Michael for 6 years. They met in college when Michael was just starting to make his way in business and Jessica was doing art. Back then, everything seemed so promising. They were young, ambitious, and madly in love with each other. However, as the years passed, everything changed. Michael got stuck in work, developing his career, and Jessica gradually moved away from her creative plans, taking on the role of a housewife. He was building his empire, and she was a family life. She cooked dinners, raised children, but there was less and less room between them for the conversations and laughter that had been before. Once they spent their evenings talking, joking, dreaming about the future, making plans for life. Now Michael came in late, tired and exhausted, completely immersed in his business problems. He greeted her with a short kiss on the cheek and sat down at his laptop. It was as if her existence had become just a backdrop to his life. Jessica felt a gap growing between them and realized that this was no longer the man she had once fallen in love with. At times, it seemed to her that Michael didn't even notice her presence. Sometimes she would quietly leave the room while he was staring at the screen to see if he would notice her absence. Spoiler alert, I didn't notice. On the evening of the same day, Michael, as usual, returned home later than promised. They hardly spoke at dinner. It annoyed her how completely absorbed he was in his phone. It's the same thing every day.
Can you ever get away from that damn phone?
Michael didn't even look up, just shrugged.
Sorry, honey, work. I'm trying to finish everything. We have a major project coming up.
She exhaled, holding back her irritation. It's always the same excuse, work. As if he didn't have any other conversations left. When was the last time they laughed together? When was the last time we didn't talk about who was running where and what to do next? Jessica pushed her plate away and got up from the table.
You're always busy. You never have time for us.
Michael finally looked up, but only to look at her in surprise.
What are you talking about? I'm working for us, for the sake of the children. It's for our family.
He turned back to the phone, making it clear that the conversation was over. But he didn't understand. The money he earned couldn't bring back the feelings she once had. He was no longer the man she loved. He became aloof, and Jessica began to realize that she was feeling increasingly lonely. A few months have passed, and their life has become like the script of a low-grade sitcom, a monotonous routine where no one plays the main roles anymore. And all the important moments are behind the scenes. Jessica played the role of an exemplary wife, but inside she felt empty. Michael didn't even try to fill this void. He was too passionate about his work. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Jessica was standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom, brushing her hair. Michael had just returned from another meeting, and his face was tense as always. He took off his jacket and sat down on the bed, wearily rubbing his temples.
Michael, let's talk.
He just glanced at her, barely able to contain his irritation.
Not now, Jess. I'm tired. I have an important meeting tomorrow.
You're always tired, always busy. But when was the last time we even talked about something important? About us?
Michael sighed, as if talking to her was another task that needed to be crossed off the list.
You know, I work for us. For you. Isn't it important?
What's the point if we're not together anymore? Your job takes everything away from us. We hardly talk.
You're exaggerating. Everything is fine. You're just tired. That's all.
Those words hit her like a slap in the face. You're just tired, is that the answer? Is that what he thinks of her and her feelings? He has not tried to understand her, their marriage, their family for a long time. Jessica felt a lump in her throat and turned away to the window, unable to talk to him anymore. She was tired of it. She was tired of the fact that she always had to drag the two of them in their relationship. Michael didn't even try to fight for their marriage. His job was his first love, and Jessica was just an item on his schedule. A few more weeks passed, and the coldness in their relationship only intensified. Michael came home later and later, and his absence became almost the norm for Jessica. It seemed to her that she lived alone, despite his physical presence. She didn't try to talk to him anymore. All conversations boiled down to short "How are you and how was your day?" It was becoming clear that the marriage they had entered into had long since turned into an empty shell. Every time Michael left for another meeting or stayed late at the office, Jessica felt her heart grow. She was a woman who had no one to open her heart to, and the worst thing was that she began to realize that she no longer wanted to be with him. She was tired of being a woman who was ignored. One morning when Michael left for work, Jessica was sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee. At that moment, she got a call from James, her cousin, who suddenly decided to visit the city. He was the one who always understood her, even though they rarely saw each other. They had been close since childhood, sharing secrets and dreams. James knew her much better than Michael did.
James, hi Jess. I'll be in town next week. I'd like to see you if you have time.
Jessica smiled when she heard his voice. It was a breath of fresh air in her dull, routine life.
Of course, let's meet. I really need to talk to someone.
Thus began a chain of events that would change their lives. She did not know that meeting James would be her escape from the reality, in which she had long felt like a prisoner. It's been a few days since that phone call. Jessica was almost restless, looking forward to meeting James. He was the only person who always understood her, even as a child. She and James have always been close, despite the fact that they rarely saw each other because of his constant trips and business. He was the soul of the company, cheerful, easygoing, always knew how to cheer her up when everything seemed gloomy and meaningless. Today was the day. Jessica was sitting at the bar in a cafe that was located on the other side of the city and looked at her watch. A little excitement cast a shadow over her heart. A lot has changed over the years. She was married, she had children, but now she wanted to escape at least for a couple of hours. Michael was late at work again, and the kids were with the babysitter. Jessica felt strangely free that day, as if time had rolled back and she was once again the young, free girl she had been before marriage. The cafe was filled with the hum of conversation. Music was playing softly, but all these sounds seemed to disappear for her when she saw James coming through Disbourne. He was a little older, a little more tanned, with short curly hair that was now slightly touched with grey, but he still looked confident as always. A smile instantly lit up his face when he noticed her.
Hey, Jess.
She got up from her seat and rushed to him, hugging him tightly. The scent of his cologne was the same as always, reminding her of the distant days when they spent summers together, fooling around and laughing without worries. He hugged her back, warmly, almost tenderly.
James, you haven't changed at all.
Well, maybe I got a little older, but that doesn't count, does it?
They both laughed, and the tension she had felt before quickly dissolved. They sat down at a table, ordered coffee, and started talking as if those years of separation had never happened.
I'm so glad to see you. You haven't been in town for so long. What have you been doing all this time?
Oh, you know me. Work, travel, work again. But I decided to take a break. I needed a little break from all this chaos. And how are you? How are you doing?
The question hit her nerves. She knew he was asking sincerely, but she didn't even know how to answer honestly. Her marriage to Michael was in decline. But how could she explain this to a man who was almost a brother to her?
How can I say? Everything seems to be fine. Michael and I have been married for 6 years. We have 2 children. But to be honest, sometimes it feels like I've lost myself.
James looked at her with interest. His eyes immediately darkened with understanding.
You don't look happy, Jess. Is something wrong?
She turned away so as not to show her emotions. She sighed, trying to hide the bitterness growing inside her.
You know, Michael is constantly busy with work. He's always at the office or in meetings. We don't talk much. And when we talk, it's more like an exchange of responsibilities than real conversations. Sometimes it seems to me that we are no longer a couple.
James frowned, listening intently to her. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush her, just gave her the opportunity to talk. This was exactly what she was missing.
Jess, I can hardly imagine what it's like to be in a marriage that feels empty. But you've always been strong. You definitely don't deserve to be ignored.
Her eyes filled with tears, but she immediately wiped them away, trying not to show her weakness.
Sometimes I think it's my fault. I stopped being the woman he loved. Maybe I'm not who he wants to be with anymore.
James shook his head and covered her hand with his.
You haven't stopped being yourself, Jess. You just got lost in that run. But that doesn't mean it's your fault. You deserve to be happy.
These words penetrated deep into her heart. James always knew how to support her, always knew how to choose the right words. He didn't make empty promises to her. He didn't build illusions. But his presence in itself was what she needed right now. The conversation continued for several more hours. James talked about his adventures in different countries, shared funny stories, and Jessica laughed like she hadn't laughed in a long time. She felt alive, and she needed this lightness so much. When the cafe started to close, they decided to take a walk down the street. The night city was quiet, and Jessica found herself not wanting this evening to end. They walked side by side, sometimes touching shoulders, and a comfortable silence hung between them. Suddenly James stopped and turned to her.
Jess, you know I'll always be there for you if you feel bad, right? You can call me anytime. It doesn't matter what happens.
Jessica smiled back at him. It wasn't just words of support, it was something more. She could feel it in his gaze, in the way his eyes lingered on her face a little longer than would be normal between cousins.
Thank you, James. You always knew how to cheer me up.
He took a step closer, but did nothing more. It was like a silent promise. James's presence filled her with calmness, but at the same time something smoldered inside, not letting her forget that their relationship had long gone beyond a simple family affection. The next day they met again, and this time the tension between them became even more palpable. Jessica couldn't help but notice how her heart skipped a beat every time their eyes met. James, as if sensing this, kept his gaze on her more and more often, not hiding his interest. One evening, after a week of their meetings, James invited her to his house. It was a casual suggestion, come chat, drink wine, but Jessica knew there was more to it than that. She wanted this. I wanted to forget about my problems, about what was happening at home. She wanted to immerse herself in a world where she feels alive again. They were sitting on the balcony sipping wine. The evening was warm, and there was a tension between them that could not be ignored.
Jess, you do realize that there's something between us, right?
Her heart began to beat faster. She knew it, felt it from the very beginning, but was afraid to admit it to herself.
I know, but this is wrong, James.
He came closer, his hand slid over her shoulder, and she didn't pull away. On the contrary, her heart fluttered at the touch.
What makes you happy can't be wrong.
These words were the last straw. Jessica succumbed to what had been brewing between them all this time. Their lips met in a kiss full of passion and suppressed emotions. Everything she had been holding in for so long finally broke out. It's been a few weeks since that night when everything changed. Jessica tried to behave as usual, even though she was torn apart inside. Michael was still completely immersed in his work, and his constant absences gave Jessica the opportunity to continue her dangerous relationship with James. Each encounter with him made her more and more dependent on this forbidden pleasure, although she was well aware of what she was doing. But the feelings she felt around him were too strong to fight them. Every morning when Michael left for the office and the children went to school, Jessica found herself thinking about James. Her thoughts went back to those nights when she and James spent time together, his touch, his voice, his eyes full of passion, which she had not seen in Michael so long. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't stop. James was becoming more and more her refuge. They met in his apartment, which was located on the other side of the city, where no one could see them. He always greeted her with a smile, as if it was their own little hiding place from the world. One evening, when Michael was on another business trip and the children were at their grandmother's, Jessica came to James, and they were sitting on his couch, talking quietly.
You do realize that this can't go on forever, right?
Jessica flinched at those words, even though she had known for a long time that he was right. But the idea of stopping everything seemed too painful to her. I know, but I can't live without you, James. I don't feel alive when you're not around. James sighed, his gaze serious.
But you're going back to him anyway. You always come back to Michael, no matter what. This is wrong, Jess. We both understand that.
She looked at him, her eyes glistening with restrained tears.
Do you think it's easy for me? I feel guilty every time I come here, but I can't stop. You are the only person who understands me.
James gently stroked her cheek with his hand. His touch made her heart beat faster.
You are more than just a secret meeting for me. I don't want to be someone who hides in the shadows.
She froze for a moment, realizing the depth of his words. James was more to her than just a consolation from a boring marriage, but she still couldn't find the strength to change anything in her life. Leaving Michael meant destroying not only their marriage, but also the stability of their children. And although Michael had long ceased to be the person she loved for her, she was not ready for such a step. However, each meeting with James made her more detached from Michael. They met in secret, sometimes in a cafe on the outskirts of the city, where no one could recognize them, then in his apartment, where they spent long evenings together, forgetting about everything else. A few more weeks have passed. Michael still continued his late returns home, unaware that his wife was not spending this time alone. Every morning Jessica woke up feeling guilty, but as soon as she heard James's voice on the phone, all her moral struggle disappeared. Their relationship had become a drug she couldn't get rid of. One evening, Jessica came to James' house, and they found themselves on his couch again. This time it was different. The silence in the room seemed more oppressive than usual. Jessica was tense, her mind wandering somewhere between reality and the realization that they had gone too far.
You're kind of weird today. What are you thinking about?
Jessica rubbed her palms together nervously, avoiding his gaze.
I feel terrible, James. I betray Michael every time I come here. I do not know how long I can live like this.
He was silent for a while, considering her words, then gently put his hand on her shoulder.
I know it's difficult, but you've been unhappy with him for a long time, right? Why do you keep holding on to this marriage if it doesn't bring you happiness anymore?
She raised her eyes and looked at him, her voice full of pain.
It's not that easy, James. We have children. We have a story. And despite everything, Michael is a good man. He doesn't deserve what I'm doing.
James shook his head, with a slight bitterness in his eyes.
You can't keep living for the sake of others. It's destroying you. And me too.
His last words startled her. He was right, their secret meetings hurt not only her but also him. Her heart was torn between feeling guilty about Michael and the fire that was burning in her next to James. But despite that, she couldn't stop. Their passion captured her completely, making it impossible to return to her former life. Every touch of James, every word he said, made her forget what was right, and she plunged into this relationship with her head. Meanwhile, Michael was beginning to notice that something was wrong. Jessica was increasingly absent-minded, often absent from home, referring to meetings with friends or trips to the store, which for some reason lasted longer than usual. Her phone was always on vibration, and she was nervous when she received messages. Michael began to suspect that there was something behind her strange behavior. One evening, when Michael returned home earlier than usual, he found Jessica, who quickly put her phone in her pocket as soon as he entered.
Who were you talking to?
Jessica froze, trying not to show her emotions.
It's just a friend. We discussed her problems.
His eyes narrowed. He stared at her intently, trying to catch the lie.
Then why do you look like you're hiding something?
She felt her heart begin to pound harder. He was closer to the truth than she would have liked.
Are you interrogating me now? I don't have to answer to you for every call.
Michael frowned, his face showing incomprehension and growing suspicion.
Something's going on, Jess. You've become different. I'm feeling it. If there's anything I need to know about, tell me.
Jessica turned away to avoid his gaze. She knew that her betrayal would soon come out, but she couldn't find the strength to admit it. The fear of losing everything, his family, his home, was too great.
You were just making something up for yourself. It's all right.
But Michael wasn't a fool. His intuition told him that she was lying, and the thought haunted him. Jessica continued to date James despite the growing tension at home. They knew their bond couldn't last forever, but every time they were together, it felt right. Each meeting only intensified their passion, and soon they could no longer imagine their lives without these moments. One day, when they were sitting in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, Jessica looked at James. Her voice was quiet but full of determination.
We can't stop, really. Even though it's destroying me from the inside out.
James looked at her, his eyes full of pain and love.
I don't want to stop, but I know that sooner or later we'll have to make a decision.
She nodded, realizing that their relationship had reached the point where there was no turning back anymore. But the decision seemed too hard.
I'm afraid of destroying everything, but I can't live like this anymore.
They both knew that the end of their story was inevitable, but they weren't ready to accept it yet. The passion that burned between them was stronger than their guilt and fear of the consequences. It's been a few months since Jessica started dating James, and Michael couldn't help but notice that his wife had changed a lot. He had always been a man immersed in work, but over the past few weeks he had begun to feel that something was wrong between them. The aloofness which he had initially attributed to his own preoccupation now seemed to him a symptom of something more. At first he tried to convince himself that he was just winding himself up because of the stress at work, but Jessica's behavior was getting stranger and stranger. It all started with little things that used to seem ordinary. Jessica has always been a stay-at-home mum, preferring to spend time at home with the kids or do ordinary things. However, now she increasingly began to find reasons to leave home. Her explanations were very different. Meetings with friends, business in the city, shopping trips. Michael tried to ignore it, but each of her absences became more frequent and prolonged. On top of that, Jessica seemed distracted when they were together. She talked less and was often lost in her own thoughts. They used to discuss everything from household chores to Michael's work, but now he noticed that she avoided such conversations. Sometimes he caught her looking at him with some kind of invisible anxiety, but every time he asked her if everything was okay, Jessica answered in monosyllables, as if trying to close the subject as quickly as possible. The strangest thing was that her phone was always next to her. Michael remembered how she used to be able to leave her phone in another room and not think about it for hours. Now, her smartphone has become an integral part of her daily life. She kept it with her all the time, put it in her pocket or put it next to her when she sat down at the table. Michael noticed that she started texting with someone often, and every time a message came, Jessica seemed to tense up before looking at the screen. She smiled at her phone more and more often, but never showed who she was talking to. This alarmed him, but he tried not to make a scene for fear of being accused of paranoia. Several weeks passed, and Michael's suspicions only intensified. One evening, when he returned home earlier than usual, he found Jessica in the kitchen. She was on the phone and stopped abruptly when she saw him at the door. Her face turned pale. She immediately ended the conversation and put down the phone. This moment completely undermined Michael's trust. He began to wonder if there was more to her strange behavior than just stress or boredom. Something was wrong. As time passed, an invisible wall grew between them. Jessica continued to behave distantly, and Michael increasingly found himself thinking that his wife was cheating on him. He tried to sort out his feelings, trying to find a logical explanation for her behavior, but his inner voice told him that it was about another man. Michael had never suspected Jessica of cheating before, but her behavior became so obvious that he could no longer ignore this fact. One night, when Jessica went to bed earlier, Michael stayed in the kitchen, lost in thought. He was trying to remember exactly when it all started. Perhaps it happened after James, her cousin, returned to the city. At first, he didn't think much of it, because James was part of the family and Michael always treated him well. But now, looking back, he began to remember that after James appeared, His life with Jessica changed dramatically. She began to move away, and her absences became more frequent. They often talked about James, and Michael remembered how joyfully Jessica greeted any news about him. At the time, he attributed it to family affection, but now it looked different. These thoughts stuck in his head, and he couldn't get rid of them. Suspicions tormented him every day, every night. He couldn't look at Jessica calmly anymore. Every time she smiled at him, he tried to catch the hidden hints of a lie. When she said she was going out with her friends, he found himself not believing her. It seemed to him that everyone around him knew what was going on, but no one dared to tell him the truth. It was humiliating. He felt like he was losing control of his life, and that angered him even more. Finally, Michael decided that he could no longer tolerate this state of uncertainty. He wanted to know the truth, no matter how bitter it was. The decision was overdue unexpectedly, but firmly he had to find out what was going on. On the same day, he found on the internet a contact of a private detective who specialized in family matters. And although it seemed like an extreme step, Michael realized that he could not rely on his guesses. He wanted to know for sure. When he first met the detective, he was overcome by a strange feeling of shame. It was unpleasant for him to admit that he, a successful man, had to resort to the services of a detective to find out the truth about his wife. But despite this, he continued. The detective, a middle-aged man with a stern expression and cold eyes, was a professional in his field. He listened to Michael without emotion, asking short, businesslike questions. When did you notice the change in her behavior? The detective asked, making notes in his notebook. Michael tried to remember all the details from Jessica's first absences to her strange phone conversations. He spoke about his suspicions, mentioned James, although he himself was not sure that he was involved in the infidelities. The detective did not comment on his guesses, but Michael could see from his face that he had been working with such cases for a long time and had not ruled anything out. I'll start the surveillance, the detective said when they finished talking. I will contact you as soon as I have the results. Expect the first reports within a week. Michael nodded, feeling relieved that the process had finally started. However, this relief was mixed with growing anxiety. He knew that the truth could ruin his life, but he could no longer live in ignorance. A week passed, and the detective contacted Michael. Reports began to arrive regularly, and with each new day the picture became clearer. Jessica was actually dating someone, and it wasn't just innocent shopping trips or meetings with friends. The detective followed her movements, recorded where and with whom she went, and Michael denoted patterns. One evening, the detective sent Michael the photos. They showed Jessica leaving the cafe, and James next to her. They were sitting at a table together, her face lit up with a smile that Michael hadn't seen in a long time. They looked too close, too comfortable with each other. It wasn't just a friendly conversation. The photos confirmed his worst fears. Now he knew for sure that there was something more between his wife and her cousin. Michael felt his heart tighten with anger and pain. He had never thought that Jessica would be capable of such betrayal, especially with a man he considered part of his family. With each passing day, the anger inside Michael grew. He started staying at work longer, not wanting to return home, where Jessica continued to pretend that everything was fine. He could no longer stand her presence, her smiles, her false excuses. But so far he hadn't told her anything. He wanted to gather all the evidence so that she wouldn't have the slightest chance to deny her actions. Michael didn't even know exactly what he would do when he had all the evidence. It was hard for him to think about divorce. It meant the destruction of their entire family. It could affect the children. But deep down he knew that living like this, he can't do it anymore. Each new photo, each new message from the detective only brought him closer to the point where he would no longer be able to restrain himself. He tried to be calm, hiding his pain and anger, but inside he was literally bursting with tension. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and, most importantly, helpless. The man he loved and trusted turned out to be a stranger to him. At some point, he realized that he could no longer tolerate this lie. The decision was made. He had to act. Michael will never forget the day his world finally collapsed. For weeks now, He had been carrying a storm of emotions: anger, pain, humiliation mixed into an endless whirlpool. The suspicions that tormented him had long since turned into certainty, backed up by the evidence provided by the detective. He had seen photographs, read reports of meetings between Jessica and James, and knew that there was more than just friendship between them. But it's one thing to suspect and see everything in pictures, and it's quite another to come face to face with it. This thought haunted him and made him ready for any eventuality. The day when the exposure took place began like any other. Michael was at work, immersed in a routine of meetings and reports. He had not planned to return home ahead of time, but some vague anxiety had been nagging at him since the morning. It was as if his intuition told him that something important was going to happen today. This feeling intensified when, during lunch, he decided to check the messages on his phone and noticed a missed call from a detective. The message was short and concise: "She's with him." Michael froze in place, holding the phone in his hands. A lot of thoughts flashed through my head. Jessica is dating James again. In his house, or somewhere else? But one detail particularly stung him. The detective did not mention that they had gone somewhere to a cafe or to a meeting elsewhere. It meant only one thing: they were together in their common house, where they built their lives and raised their children. The house that had been his fortress had turned into a place where betrayal had reached its peak. Without hesitation, Michael dropped everything, silently left the office, not even bothering to warn his colleagues. His hands were shaking as he started the car, and his thoughts were confused. It seemed to him that he was acting on autopilot, in a state where his every step was dictated by anger and a determination to find out the whole truth with his own eyes. On the way home, Michael did not remember a single turn, not a single traffic light. His mind was completely focused on one thing: he wanted to catch them. I wanted to see the betrayal with my own eyes in order to destroy the last remnants of doubt. No matter what happened next, he could no longer live in ignorance. He could no longer be tormented by guesses. And when he drove into his street, his heart was beating with such force that it seemed like it was about to burst. He parked in front of the house and noticed James' car parked nearby. It was the final touch that killed any remaining illusions. It was exactly as he had feared. They were inside. When Michael reached the door, his breathing became heavy and harsh, and his fingers trembled. He took out the keys and slowly turned them in the lock. Everything was happening in slow motion. He opened the door carefully, trying not to make a sound. The house was quiet, too quiet. But he knew they were here. The intuition, the very feeling that had been pulling him here all day, had now turned into confidence. Michael went inside and stood for a moment listening. There was a faint noise coming from the living room, the rustle of clothes, muffled voices. His body tensed, and anger began to rise like a tidal wave. He took a step towards the living room, and what he saw exceeded all his expectations. Jessica and James were sitting on the couch, too close to each other, as if the whole world outside this room didn't exist. Her hand was on his knee, and his was on her shoulder. They were talking quietly, but Michael couldn't hear the words. It was enough for him to see their bodies locked in the same space, too intimate for cousins. This visual image caused the blood to pound in his temples. The world before his eyes shrank to a single moment where only betrayal existed. Anger overwhelmed him so quickly that he didn't have time to stop or think about his actions. He took a step forward and abruptly pushed open the living room door, causing it to crash against the wall. Jessica jumped up from her seat. Her eyes widened in shock, and her face turned pale. James jumped up too, trying to figure out what was going on, but Michael was already in front of them, overcome with rage. There was a tense silence in the room. Michael felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins, his gaze darting between Jessica and James, who, judging by his expression, did not know what to say or how to behave. The words themselves began to come out of Michael's mouth harsh, full of pain and anger. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. His wife, with whom he spent so many years, who bore him children, is sitting next to another man, and this man is her cousin. Family. The family he trusted. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a complete destruction of all the moral foundations on which their lives were built. Michael couldn't stop. He was yelling at James, at Jessica, accusing them of ruining his life, his family. Words of insults, threats that he did not even try to restrain were spinning in his head. He said that he would destroy them both, that they would regret what they had done. His rage knew no bounds. Jessica stood frozen, unable to answer or justify herself. She knew there were no excuses. Tears were streaming down her face, but Michael couldn't sympathize with her. At that moment, she ceased to be a human being for him. She became the embodiment of his pain and betrayal. All he could see was how she had betrayed his trust. James tried to speak, but Michael didn't give him a chance. His anger was so intense that he could barely restrain himself from hitting him. Every time James opened his mouth, Michael interrupted him with threats and accusations. At one point, he even came closer, raising his hand, but stopped, feeling that this was a step that he would not be able to return. The room was heated to the limit. Both Jessica and James looked like they wanted to disappear but couldn't. They stood in front of Michael like criminals caught red-handed, unable to defend themselves from his anger. Every moment was filled with tension, and neither of them knew how it would end. Michael felt the rage grow into something deeper, into a pain that tore at his heart. He was screaming, but behind his words was the broken soul of a man who had lost everything. His marriage, his family, his faith in his loved ones, it all seemed like an illusion now. And as much as he wanted it to be just a nightmare, he knew that this was reality, and that this reality could no longer be avoided. He stood in front of them, breathing heavily, his hands clenched into fists, but he didn't know what to do next. All he could feel was the emptiness that enveloped him from within. The anger was fading, leaving only debris behind. At some point, Michael turned around and left the house. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing: his life would never be the same. Michael didn't come home that night. He simply rode off into the unknown, leaving behind the ruins of what had once been his home, his family, and his life. After Michael left the house where the storm of his anger had raged, Jessica was left standing in the middle of the devastated space. Realizing that her life had just collapsed, there was a dead silence in the room, where tension had reigned until recently. She stood motionless, as if frozen, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Her body felt heavy, and her mind was clouded by pain and confusion. It's over. All her illusions that she would somehow be able to maintain this delicate balance between a secret relationship with James and marriage with Michael to dust. James, feeling unbearably awkward and aware of the horror of what was happening, quickly left without saying a word. He realized that this moment left no room for excuses or explanations. Their connection, which had seemed so intriguing and exciting, now turned into a devastating explosion that destroyed everything around. He knew he couldn't stay by Jessica's side, at least not now when she had to face the consequences. When the door closed behind him, Jessica finally let the tears flow freely down her cheeks. She collapsed onto the couch where she had been sitting with James just a few minutes ago, and felt the cold reality cover her head. Thoughts of what she had lost flooded her mind. Michael is the man with whom she has connected her life, the father of her children, the one whom she once sincerely loved. She betrayed him. Her family, her home, all seemed lost forever now. Jessica was aware that Michael, by leaving, had left her no chance of a quick reconciliation. His face distorted with anger, his cry full of pain. All this testified that for him their relationship would never be the same. He didn't just find out about her cheating, he saw her firsthand, and this fact left an indelible mark. The question of whether he would ever be able to forgive her seemed hopeless to her now. She saw all the bridges between them crumbling and realized that the future, which she had recently considered possible, was now unattainable. Several days passed, but Michael did not return. He didn't answer her calls or text her. The house was frighteningly empty. The children, not understanding what was happening, tried to return to normal life, but felt an anxious atmosphere. Jessica tried to behave as usual, take care of the children, go shopping, do housework, but every corner of the house reminded her that everything was destroyed. Her inner state was full of chaos. She felt guilty in front of Michael, in front of the children, in front of herself. She understood that ever since she allowed herself to get involved in a relationship with James, she was destroying her life step by step. Everything that seemed exciting and new to her, everything that gave her a sense of freedom, now became a chain that she did not know how to get rid of. Her relationship with James no longer seemed like an escape from a routine marriage. It was a dark secret that destroyed everything she had once valued. It seemed to her that James was no longer what he had been to her in the beginning. He was now a symbol of her shattered world, and every time she thought about him, she was overcome with pain and regret. Jessica couldn't help but think that maybe she could have prevented all this. Memories of the days when she could still talk to Michael, when they could discuss their problems, began to pop up in her memory. She recalled how he tried to make contact, and she pushed him away, losing touch with what they had built together. Perhaps if she had stopped and talked to him then, if she had tried to sort out their relationship, none of this would have happened. But now it was too late. She tried to talk to the children, to explain to them why Dad didn't come home anymore, but her words were confused and lacking confidence. How can you explain to children that their mother destroyed their family? How can she tell them that she betrayed their father and now does not know what will happen next? Jessica felt more guilty about them than about anyone else. She had destroyed their safe world, and now she needed to find a way to pick up the pieces. Meanwhile, James tried to get in touch several times. He was texting, calling, trying to find out how she was coping with the situation, but Jessica wasn't answering. Deep down, she knew that their relationship could no longer continue. All the feelings that had once connected them now seemed like a deception. She couldn't look at James the way she used to. He was a reminder that her weakness had led to disaster, and every time she thought about him, a wave of shame swept over her. A few more weeks passed, and Jessica was faced with a choice: try to regain Michael's trust or continue her relationship with James. She understood that both paths were full of pain and suffering. Getting Michael back meant facing a lengthy process of rebuilding a broken relationship, if at all possible. Would he forgive her? Will he ever be able to forget that she betrayed him with a man who was part of their family? These questions tormented her every day. On the other hand, continuing her relationship with James seemed impossible to her now. She couldn't go back to those secret meetings that had once seemed like a way out. It was no longer just an adventure, it became a symbol of her ruined life, and she couldn't relive it. Every night, lying in an empty bed, Jessica wondered what she should do. She knew that if she wanted any chance of rebuilding her life, she would have to start with the hardest part, trying to talk to Michael. But how to do it? How can I get him back if he's not ready to listen to her? She decided that perhaps the first thing she needed to do was admit her mistakes to herself. For many years she hid her feelings, avoided frank conversations, and this led to the fact that her marriage was slowly collapsing. Now she realized that she would not be able to move on if she did not face the truth. Jessica wrote a long letter to Michael. She described everything in it: her pain, her regret, her understanding of what she had done. She did not ask for forgiveness, knowing that it might never happen. She just wanted him to know that she was aware of her guilt and was ready to accept any consequences. The letter lay on the kitchen table for several days before she decided to send it. This was the first step towards trying to bring back at least a piece of what was destroyed. It took several more weeks before Michael answered. He didn't come home, didn't call, but sent a short message. There was no anger or forgiveness in him. It was just a message that he had received a letter and realized that they had a long way to go. He didn't know if they would ever be able to repair their relationship, but he was ready to at least start a conversation. It was a faint ray of hope, but for Jessica it meant that she hadn't lost everything yet. Michael was willing to at least listen, which meant there might be a chance. The question was whether she would now be able to take responsibility for her actions and go down this difficult path. Jessica realized that her life would never be the same. The mistakes she had made couldn't just be erased, but perhaps there was a chance that, after going through this ordeal, She could at least try to find a new meaning in her life, not for herself, but for the sake of the children, for the sake of the family that was destroyed by her own hands. She didn't know how this story would end, but one thing she knew for sure: she had a long and difficult way to recover at least something. And although the past could not be changed, she hoped that the future would bring at least a small chance of redemption.